tourists visit sub-Saharan Africa, they often wonder why there are no historical buildings or monuments, like they see in Europe or America. The reason is simple. The Europeans destroyed most of them. We only have a few drawings and descriptions by travelers who visited the ancient cities before they were destroyed. In some places, ruins are still visible, but not many. Many cities were abandoned when Europeans brought exotic diseases, smallpox and influenza, which started spreading and killing the locals. Most of those cities lie hidden and forgotten. In fact, the biggest part of Africa's history is still under the ground. There are lots of these ancient African cities that we would love to cover, but this video will only cover a few that we have ready information about. Now, let's begin. The great city of Benin. At the end of the 13th century, a European traveler encountered the great metropolis in West Africa, in the present-day Edo state of Nigeria. He wrote, "The town seems to be very great. When you enter into it, you go into a great broad street, not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Wormhouse Street in Amsterdam. The King's Palace is a collection of buildings which occupy as much space as the town of Haarlem, and which are enclosed with walls. There are numerous apartments for the prince's ministers and fine galleries, most of which are as big as those on the exchange at Amsterdam. They are supported by wooden pillars encased with copper, where their victories are depicted, and which are carefully kept very clean. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and 120 feet wide, apart from an infinity of small intersecting streets. The houses are close to one another, arranged in good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. They wash and scrub their houses so well that they are polished and shining like a looking glass." Source: Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, page 69. Benin art of the Middle Ages was of the highest quality. An official of the Berlin Museum für Völkerkunde once stated, "These works from Benin are equal to the very finest examples of European casting technique. Benvenuto Cellini could not have cast them better, nor could anyone else before or after him." Technically, these bronzes represent the very highest possible achievement. Sadly, in 1897, Benin City was destroyed by British forces under Admiral Harry Rawson. The city was looted, blown up and burnt to the ground. A collection of the famous Benin bronzes are now in the British Museum in London. Part of the 700 stolen bronzes by the British troops were sold back to Nigeria in 1972. The great city of Timbuktu. Did you know that in the 14th century, the city of Timbuktu in West Africa was 5 times bigger than the city of London, and was the richest city in the world? Today, Timbuktu is 236 times smaller than London. It has little to show of a modern city. Its population is 2 times less than 5 centuries ago, impoverished with beggars and dirty street sellers. The town itself is incapable of conserving its past ruined monuments and archives. Back in the 14th century, the 3 richest places on Earth were China, Iran/Iraq, and the Mali Empire in West Africa. From all 3, the only one which was still independent and prosperous was the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire lived on under the rule of the richest man ever in the history of humanity, Mansa Musa, emperor of the 14th century Mali Empire, which covered modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea. At the time of his death in 1331, Mansa Musa was worth the equivalent of $400 billion. At that time, Mali Empire was producing more than half the world's supply of salt and gold. When Mansa Musa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he carried so much gold and spent it so lavishly that the price of gold fell for 10 years. He was accompanied by 60,000 people. He founded the Library of Timbuktu, and the famous manuscripts of Timbuktu, which cover all areas of world knowledge, were written during his reign. Witnesses of the greatness of the Mali Empire came from all parts of the world. Sergio Damian, an Italian art and architecture scholar, wrote the following about this period. Thus was laid the foundation of an urban civilization. At the height of its power, Mali had at least 400 cities, and the interior of the Niger Delta was very densely populated. The Malian city of Timbuktu had a 14th century population of 115,000 to 5 times larger than medieval London. National Geographic recently described Timbuktu as the Paris of the medieval world, on account of its intellectual culture. According to Professor Henry Louis Gates, 25,000 university students studied there. Many old West African families have private library collections that go back hundreds of years. The Mauritanian cities of Gedi and Udain have a total of 3,450 handwritten medieval books. There may be another 6,000 books still surviving in the other city of Wallata. Some date back to the 8th century AD. There are 11,000 books in private collections in Niger. In Timbuktu today, there are about 700,000 surviving books. They are written in Mande, Suchi, Fulani, Timbuktu, and Sudani. The contents of the manuscripts include math, medicine, poetry, law, and astronomy. The world's first encyclopedia was created in Mali in the 14th century, eons before the Europeans got the idea 4 centuries later. A collection of 1,600 books was considered a small library for a West African scholar of the 16th century. Professor Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu is recorded as saying that he had the smallest library of any of his friends. He had only 1,600 volumes. Concerning these old manuscripts, actor Michael Palin, in his TV series Sahara, said the Imam of Timbuktu has a collection of scientific texts that clearly show the planets circling the sun. They date back hundreds of years. There is convincing evidence that the scholars of Timbuktu knew a lot more than their counterparts in Europe. In the 15th century in Timbuktu, mathematicians knew about the rotation of the planets, knew about the details of the eclipse. They knew things which we had to wait for 150, almost 200 years to know in Europe when Galileo and Copernicus came up with these same calculations and were given a very hard time for it. The old Malian capital of Niamey had a 14th century building called the Hall of Audience. It was surmounted by a dome, adorned with arabesques of striking colors. The windows of an upper floor were plated with wood and framed in silver, those of a lower floor were plated with wood and framed in gold. Malian sailors got to America in 1311 AD, 181 years before Columbus. An Egyptian scholar, Ibn Fadl al-Amari, published this sometime around 1342. In the 10th chapter of his book, there is an account of 2 large maritime voyages ordered by the predecessor of Mansa Musa, a king who inherited the Malian throne in 1312. This mariner king is not named by al-Amari, but modern writers identify him as Mansa Abubakari II. Excerpt from Robin Walker's book, When We Ruled. Those events were happening at the same period when Europe as a continent was plunged into the Dark Age, ravaged by plague and famine, its people killing one another for religious and ethnic reasons. Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti Kingdom. Kumasi was the capital of the Ashanti Kingdom, between the 10th and 20th centuries. Drawings of life in Kumasi show homes, often of 2 stories, square buildings with thatched roofs, with family compounds arranged around a courtyard. The Manhaya Palace complex drawn in another sketch was similar to a Norman castle, only more elegant in its architecture. These 2-story thatched homes of the Ashanti Kingdom were timber-framed and the walls were of lath and plaster construction. A tree always stood in the courtyard, which was the central point of a family compound. The tree of life was the altar for family offerings to God, Nyam. A brass pan sat in the branches of the tree into which offerings were placed. This was the same in every courtyard of every household, temple and palace. The king's representatives and officials worked in open-sided buildings. The purpose was that everyone was welcome to see what they were up to. The townhouses of Kumasi had upstairs toilets in 1817. This city in the 1800s is documented in drawings and photographs. Promenades and public squares, cosmopolitan lives, exquisite architecture, and everywhere spotless and ordered, a wealth of architecture, history, prosperity, and extremely modern living. P.D. Lawton, Africanagenda.net. Winwood Reade described his visit to the Ashanti Royal Palace of Kumasi in 1874. We went to the King's Palace, which consists of many courtyards, each surrounded with alcoves and verandas, and having 2 gates or doors so that each yard was a thoroughfare. But the part of the palace fronting the street was a stone house, Moorish in its style, with a flat roof and a parapet, and suites of apartments on the first floor. It was built by Fanny Masons many years ago. The rooms upstairs remind me of Wardour Street. Each was a perfect old curiosity shop. Books in many languages, Bohemian glass, clocks, silver plates, old furniture, Persian rugs, Kidderminster carpets, pictures and engravings, numberless chests and coffers. A sword bearing the inscription from Queen Victoria to the King of Ashanti. A copy of the Times, October 17, 1843. With these were many specimens of Moorish and Ashanti handicraft. Robin Walter. The beautiful city of Kumasi was blown up, destroyed by fire, and looted by the British at the end of the 19th century. The Tanzanian city of Kilwa. In 1331, Ibn Battuta described the Tanzanian city of Kilwa, of the Zanj, Swahili-speaking people, as follows. One of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world, the whole of it is elegantly built. The ruins are complete with Gothic arches and intricate stonework, examples of exquisite architecture. Kilwa dates back to the 9th century and was at its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. This international African port minted its own currency in the 11th to 14th centuries. Remains of artifacts link it to Spain, China, Arabia, and India. The inhabitants, architects, and founders of this city were not Arabs, and the only influence the Europeans had in the form of the Portuguese was to mark the start of the decline, most likely through smallpox and influenza. Source: UNESCO World Heritage Center, excerpt from The Invisible Empire by P.D. Lawton. A visitor in 1331 AD considered the Tanzanian city of Kilwa to be of world class. He wrote that it was the principal city on the coast, the greater part of whose inhabitants are Zanj of very black complexion. Later on he says that Kilwa is one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities in the world. The whole of it is elegantly built. Bling culture existed in early Tanzania. A Portuguese chronicler of the 16th century wrote, "They are finely clad in many rich garments of gold and silk and cotton, and the women as well, also with much gold and silver chains and bracelets, which they wear on their legs and arms, and many jeweled earrings in their ears." In 1961, a British archaeologist found the ruins of Husuni Kubwa, the royal palace of the Tanzanian city of Kilwa. It had over 100 rooms, including a reception hall, galleries, courtyards, terraces and an octagonal swimming pool. In 1505, Portuguese forces destroyed and burned down the Swahili cities of Kilwa and Mombasa. Ghana Empire. A Moorish nobleman who lived in Spain by the name of al-Bakri questioned merchants who visited the Ghana Empire in the 11th century and wrote this about the king. He sits in the audience or to hear grievances against officials in a domed pavilion around which stand 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered materials. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the kings of his country wearing splendid garments and their hair plaited with gold. The governor of the city sits on the ground before the king, and around him are ministers seated likewise. In 15th century, when the Portuguese, the first Europeans to sail the Atlantic coasts of Africa, arrived in the coast of Guinea and landed at Vita in West Africa, the captains were astonished to find streets well laid out, bordered on either side for several leagues by 2 rows of trees. For days they traveled through a country of magnificent fields, inhabited by men clad in richly colored garments of their own weaving. A continent of kings, queens and great kingdoms. Until the end of the 16th century, Africa was far more advanced than Europe in terms of political organization, science, technology, and culture. That prosperity continued, despite the European slavery ravages, till the 17th and 18th centuries. Longo City of Congo. Longo City in the Congo/Angola area is depicted in another drawing from the mid-1600s. Yet again, a vast planned city of linear layout, stretching across several miles and entirely surrounded by city walls, bustling with trade. The King S complex alone was a 1.5 mile enclosure with courtyards and gardens. The people of Longo used maths not just for arithmetic purposes but for astrological calculations. They used advanced maths and linear algebra. The Ashango bone from the Congo is a calculator that is 25,000 years old. The so-called Ashango bone S inscriptions consist of 2 columns of odd numbers that add up to 60, with the left column containing prime numbers between 10 and 20, and the right column containing both added and subtracted numbers. Source: Ta Netter Foundation. It is on view in a museum in Belgium. Excerpt from The Invisible Empire by P.D. Lawton. The beautiful city of Longo was destroyed by European fortune hunters, pseudo-missionaries, and other kinds of freebooters. On the subject of cloth, Congolese textiles were also distinguished. Various European writers of the 16th and 17th centuries wrote of the delicate crafts of the peoples living in eastern Congo and adjacent regions who manufactured damasks, sarsenets, satins, taffeta, cloth of tissue and velvet. Kanem-Borno Empire. In Nigeria, the royal palace in the city of Kano dates back to the 15th century. Begun by Muhammad Rumfa, ruled 1463–99, it has gradually evolved over generations into a very imposing complex. A colonial report of the city from 1902 described it as a network of buildings covering an area of 33 acres and surrounded by a wall 20 to 30 feet high outside and 15 feet inside, in itself no mean citadel. A 16th century traveler visited the Central African civilization of Kanem-Borno and commented that the emperor's cavalry had golden stirrups, spurs, bits and buckles. Even the ruler's dogs had chains of the finest gold. One of the government positions in medieval Kanem-Borno was Astronomer Royal. Ngazarbamu, the capital city of Kanem-Borno, became one of the largest cities in the 17th century world. By 1658 AD, the metropolis, according to an architectural scholar, housed about 250,000 people. It had 660 streets. Many were wide and unbending, reflective of town planning. Serena in Nigeria. The Nigerian city of Serena flourished in the 16th century. Even in ruin, it was an impressive sight, built on a horizontal vertical grid. A modern scholar describes it thus: the walls of Serena are about 10 miles in circumference and include many large bastions or walled suburbs running out at right angles to the main wall. The large compound at Kanta is still visible in the center, with ruins of many buildings, one of which is said to have been two-storied. The striking feature of the walls and whole ruins is the extensive use of stone and sakua, laterite gravel, or very hard red building mud, evidently brought from a distance. There's a big mound of this near the north gate about 8 feet in height. The walls show regular courses of masonry to a height of 20 feet and more in several places. The best preserved portion is that known as Sarati, the bridge, a little north of the eastern gate. The main city walls here appear to have provided a very strongly guarded entrance about 30 feet wide. Great Zimbabwe of Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, there are at least 600 stone-built ruins in the regions of Zimbabwe, Mozambique and South Africa. These ruins are called Mazimbabwe in Shona, the Bantu language of the builders, and means Great Revered House and signifies court. Great Zimbabwe was the largest of these ruins. It consists of 12 clusters of buildings, spread over 3 square miles. Its outer walls were made from 100,000 tons of granite bricks. In the 14th century, the city housed 18,000 people, comparable in size to that of London of the same period. Bling culture existed in this region. At the time of our last visit, the Horniman Museum in London had exhibits of headrests with the caption, "Headrests have been used in Africa since the time of the Egyptian pharaohs." Remains of some headrests, once covered in gold foil, have been found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe and burial sites like Mapungubwe dating to the 12th century after Christ. On Bling culture, one 17th century visitor to the Southern African Empire of Monomotapa, that ruled over this vast region, wrote that, "The people dress in various ways. At the court of the kings their grandees wear cloths of rich silk, damask, satin." In 1571 Portuguese forces invaded Mungimutapa, and started the destruction of the place. Gedi town of Kenya. Gedi, near the coast of Kenya, is one of the East African ghost towns. Its ruins, dating from the 14th or 15th centuries, include the city walls, the palace, private houses, the Great Mosque, 7 smaller mosques, and 3 pillar tombs. The ruined mosque in the Kenyan city of Gedi had a water purifier made of limestone for recycling water. The palace in the Kenyan city of Gedi contains evidence of piped water controlled by taps. In addition, it had bathrooms and indoor toilets. Other cities that were destroyed. The Bami-like structures of Cameroon are of mind-blowing architectural delicateness and beauty. The Bamum and Shomum scripts of Cameroon are similar to those of Ethiopia. The question now is this: why were these cities destroyed? The Terra Nullius Law. The sad truth is that European invaders have destroyed most of the ancient African cities either as punitive actions or under the scramble for Africa's Terra Nullius Law. During the scramble for Africa by Europeans, the main way to prove that a land was qualified for colonization or takeover was terra nullius, a Latin expression deriving from Roman law meaning land belonging to no one, which is used in international law to describe territory which has never been subject to the sovereignty of any state, or over which any prior sovereign has expressly or implicitly relinquished sovereignty. Sovereignty over territory which is terra nullius may be acquired through occupation. Many islands were acquired that way when it was possible to slaughter the small population and easily prove that the land was empty before the arrival of colonial powers. But very soon, the colonial powers were in difficulty to find land belonging to no one. Africa was not a terra nullius. Consequently, the terra nullius law was altered to include land inhabited by savages and uncivilized people. Again, very quickly the colonial power found it difficult to prove that Africa was a land of savages and uncivilized people. Instead, they found, as demonstrated above, queendoms and kingdoms with great palaces and highly developed political and social norms. At this stage, the colonial power had to destroy any sign of civilization. From then on, the colonial power spent a lot of energy destroying and burning African historical buildings and monuments and slaughtered the African elite of engineers, scientists, craftsmen, writers, philosophers, etc. There is a museum in Paris with 18,000 human heads of people killed by the French colonial troops and missionaries. It's called Musée d'Histoire Naturelle de Paris. Among the heads are the ones of African kings, kings' families, African engineers, writers, army officers, and spiritual leaders, but also ordinary men, women, and children that the French found unusual, exotic enough or interesting to kill to enrich their Museum of Natural History, where they display mainly animal skulls to represent biodiversity and evolution. France was not alone in the European competition to behead the maximum of variety of exotic people. The skulls and heads of many Africans still could be found in museums and unusual places around Europe. Another consequence of the terra nullius law, defined as a land inhabited by savages, led to the capture of Africans to display in zoos and public events around Europe, in primitive conditions, to demonstrate the inferiority and barbarism of the African people. From that moment till now, most Europeans still think Africans are savages, inferior, grotesque, unintelligent people. The more an African would display features that would fit that stigma, the more he or she would be liked by them. Sadly, little is left of our ancestors. When Europeans invaded Africa, they applied the four basic principles of any occupant forces. First, kill the strong and loot the place. Second, breed the weak. Third, kill, deport or exile the smartest and the most skilled ones. Fourth, impose the golden colonial rule, my way or the highway. The kings and their descendants were all killed. Additionally, 3 centuries of transatlantic slavery exported over 12 million of the finest men and women from Africa to America. Tens of millions have died in the process. Imagine what would happen to any country or civilization when almost all its writers, storytellers, engineers, craftsmen, artists, and leaders are killed or exiled. And any sign of their past glory and ingenuity destroyed or burned. Their books and records of knowledge were stolen or destroyed. Who will transmit this century-accumulated knowledge to ordinary men and women? It's that broken link to knowledge and leadership for the last 3 centuries which has plunged the whole continent into a dark age, its people left without guidance. Our fearless warriors and civilization builders are gone. Our global traders, pyramid, kingdom and empire builders are extinct. Unsurprisingly, none of these present generations have been nurtured to create empires, wage wars, defend their territory, and protect their children and women. Same reason why we don't have any more of the modern version of the fearless African warriors and civilization builders. When some people ask why are they so poor, we answer they are not poor, they have been made poor. Today, if you want to see the glory of Africa, you have to go to Europe, where thousands and thousands of stolen art objects and civilization artifacts are in public museums and private collections, in the UK, France, Germany, Belgium, Germany, etc. If you want to see the wealth of Africa, you have also to go to Europe where they are stored in private and public accounts. 5 centuries of plundering and destruction brought the continent to its knees. As P.D. Lawton put it, from Egypt to the Sudan, from Mali to Tanzania, from Zimbabwe to Mozambique, Africa is full of the testimony to her past. In many cases, the complete destruction of structures has not been through natural elements but deliberate acts, most notably of the British Empire. The museums of Britain and Europe are full of the results of pillage and plunder. There are numerous ancient structures that are in a state of good preservation, but in the case of many of Africa's cities, palaces, temples, and trading ports of old, we are left with nothing other than the written reports and drawings of traders and travelers from medieval times to the final days of complete destruction in the late 1800s. In terms of beauty and even on occasion scale, the architecture of Egypt's pyramids pale in comparison to other African historical structures. The diversity of architecture from this continent is staggering. The use of what is termed fractal scaling in building highlights a religious tradition practiced throughout the continent. Fractal scaling is the Mandelbrot idea of architecture where the smallest parts of a structure resemble the largest parts. This cultural/religious tradition is practiced in all aspects of life, from weaving to grinding cereals to the building of homes and palaces, and is the incorporation of history and explanation of the universe and our place within it, into everyday lives, lest we forget. We need to invest time and resources to unearth ourselves the ruins of our old cities to strengthen the faith of a young generation in our ability to rebound. It's time we revive in the mind of a new generation of Africans the true nature of their ancestors, the past glory of their empires, the pride of its warriors, conquerors and civilization builders, and clearly make them understand that the 5 centuries of shame under European occupation shall end with a new generation of leaders and builders. But while we do that, we must not forget that there are still many African institutions that are being destroyed right now under our noses by foreign agendas and propaganda. Talk about the African family system, indigenous knowledge systems, medicine, education, spirituality, the African Ubuntu-based system of economy, etc. being destroyed and replaced by things that have no humanity in their foundation but greed and selfish drive for wealth. So, while we look at ancient African cities destroyed by Europeans, we must not lose sight of the fact that inasmuch as those days were reflections of how great Africa was, we have a duty now to go beyond what was and start to build what we want to see in our present day and for our future. Thank you for watching.